Vivienne Ashford set her pen down in the middle of a sentence. Not because she had run out of words, but because she had just understood something she could not ununderstand. Her husband had introduced her to the new county land commissioner that afternoon as his secretary. Not corrected himself, not laughed at the mistake. He had said it with the easy confidence of a man who believed what he was saying, shaken the commissioner's hand, and moved on to discuss drainage rights along the eastern property line. Vivienne had smiled. She had always smiled, and that smile, she realized, standing in the hallway of the house she had been running for 9 years, had been the most expensive thing she had ever given away for free. The Ashford estate in western Pennsylvania sat on 400 acres that Vivienne had not inherited and had not been given. She had organized them. When she married Gerald Ashford at 23, the estate's ledgers were 3 years behind. The tenant farmers had been quietly leaving for cheaper land to the south, and Gerald's correspondence with the Philadelphia banking house had grown politely threatening. She had fixed all of it within 18 months. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because it needed doing, and she was standing right there, and she had always been the kind of woman who could not watch a thing break without understanding exactly how to repair it. Gerald had noticed in the way that men of a certain temperament notice things that are now working, which is to say, he had stopped noticing them at all. The accounts balanced. The tenants stayed. The correspondence with Philadelphia became cordial again. The estate ran with the quiet efficiency of a well-wound clock, and Gerald moved through it with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed good clocks wound themselves. 9 years. Vivienne had been 23 when she came here. She was 32 now, and the woman the commissioner had just met was apparently named Miss Whitfield, which was Gerald's late mother's maiden name, and which Vivienne had worn for exactly 4 seconds before she understood what it meant that he had said it so easily. If this story speaks to something you recognize, stay. Follow where it leads. The Ashford parlor on the night of the commissioner's visit seated 9. Vivienne had arranged those 9 seats herself. As she arranged everything, she had placed Commissioner Hale beside Gerald, because Hale needed to believe the irrigation proposal was his own idea before Gerald could get him to sign it. She had positioned Gerald's cousin Aldrich away from the window because Aldrich grew quarrelsome when cold. She had put the younger attorney, a man named Francis Webb, at the end of the table where he could speak without being interrupted. Because Francis was going to be important to Gerald's interests in 3 years, and Gerald had not yet learned to see that. Vivienne had learned to see everything. She sat at the side of the table, not the foot. Gerald's mother had sat at the foot, and Gerald had never quite reassigned the position, so Vivienne had quietly claimed the chair that gave her the best view of everyone's face. It was not a position of honor. It was a position of information, and that distinction had come to feel over 9 years, like the most accurate summary of her role in this house. The roast had been served. The conversation had moved where she had directed it to move, which is to say, it moved there naturally, without anyone noticing it was being directed. Gerald was speaking well. She had told him that morning about Hale's concerns regarding the northern boundary survey, and Gerald had absorbed the information and was now delivering it back as his own considered opinion, which was how it always worked, and which had always been, in some complicated way she had never fully examined. Fine. It had been fine. Then Gerald turned to introduce her and said, "Miss Whitfield is the one who keeps things running," and smiled, and turned back to Hale, and the conversation continued. Vivienne felt the words travel through her, the way cold water travels. Not painfully, just with a totality that left no part of her untouched. Miss Whitfield had been dead for 11 years. She had attended the funeral. Gerald had held her arm at the grave and said, "She would have liked you." Vivienne had thought at the time that this was the kindest thing he had ever said to her. She understood now, in a way she had not understood then, that it was also the most revealing. She smiled. Francis Webb, sitting at the far end of the table, caught her eye briefly. His expression held something careful. Not pity, something more precise than that. The look of a man who had understood what had just happened and was deciding whether it was his place to say so. She looked away first. She always looked away first. She always looked away first. Francis found her in the side corridor 20 minutes later, while the men had moved to Gerald's study, and Vivienne had excused herself with the practiced invisibility she had spent 9 years perfecting. She was standing with her back to the wall, not upset, or not what she would have called upset. She was very still, in the manner of someone who has made a calculation and is waiting for the answer to resolve. "It was a slip," Francis said. He did not sound certain. She looked at him. His mother's name. I know whose name it is. He was tired. He was... Francis stopped. "Vivienne, he said wrong things before. Not like that." She kept her voice level. "Not that name, in that context, with that ease. People don't reach for names without reason, Francis. He reached for her because she was already in his mind when he thought about this house. Whatever that tells you, it tells you something." Francis was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "Go back in," she said. "Someone needs to watch Aldrich's glass, and Hale's wife looks like she is about to mention the Bradford case, which Gerald cannot hear about in front of Francis." He looked at her steadily. "That's not what I asked." "Good evening, Francis," she said, not unkindly, and walked back toward the parlor. He watched her go with the expression of a man observing something that is already broken and simply has not yet acknowledged the fact. The guests left by 9:30. Vivienne oversaw every departure with the correct warmth, the correct particular detail for each person. She told Commissioner Hale's wife that her brooch was exceptional craftsmanship and meant it. She told Aldrich that the weather would be better for riding by Thursday, and watched the information land with the pleased surprise of a man who had not expected anyone to remember his plans. She pressed palms and offered thanks, and saw each person off with the specific attention that made them feel they had been the most important guests in the room. Gerald stood beside her for the last 3 departures. His hand came briefly to the small of her back as Hale said his final goodnight, and she registered the contact the way you register the temperature of water before deciding whether to enter it. When the last carriage went down the drive, Gerald exhaled and said, "That went well." "It did," Vivienne said. "Hale will come round on the northern survey. He's stubborn, but he's not stupid." "No," Vivienne said. "He isn't." Gerald looked at her briefly, the way he looked at the barometer when he passed it in the hallway. "Quick check. Move on. Early night. Will you have Margaret bring coffee to the study by 7? I want to get through the Carlisle correspondence before the morning ride." "Of course," she said. He went inside. Vivienne stood on the front steps alone. The Pennsylvania hills were dark against a darker sky, and somewhere below the property line she could hear the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the tenant farms. The one she had rerouted 2 years ago because the old path had been flooding the Hadley family's winter crops. Gerald had signed the paperwork. He had not known it was coming until the project was complete. She had told him after the fact, framed as a routine matter, because she had learned that certain kinds of competence alarmed him when he encountered them in advance. She stood there until she was certain he was upstairs. Then she went inside and gave Margaret the instruction about coffee, and thanked the kitchen for their work, and walked through the ground floor in the way she always did after an evening, checking locks, putting out unnecessary lamps, noting what would need addressing. She stopped in the small office off the corridor. Her desk. Her ledger. 9 years of her attention and intelligence pressed into every entry, every cross-referenced account, every quiet correspondence that kept this estate solvent and this man's reputation intact. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about the name. Not the name itself. She had made her peace, or something she had called her peace, with Gerald's attachment to his mother long ago. What she thought about was the texture of how it had come out of him. No hesitation. No flicker of self-correction, as though the woman managing his home, overseeing his accounts, directing his social calendar, advising his business correspondence, as though that woman's name had simply never fixed itself firmly enough in his working mind to stay there under pressure. She had been 23 when they married. It had not been a love match in the way that phrase is usually meant. It had been a reasonable arrangement between a family of declining resources and a man of growing ambition, and Vivienne had entered it with the clear-eyed practicality she brought to most things. and had told herself that respect was a fair substitute for affection, and had mostly believed it. She had stopped believing it. She recognized this now, lying in the dark, sometime around the 5th year when she had redirected a dinner conversation away from a land dispute that would have cost Gerald a partnership worth 2 years of harvest income. And he had looked at her afterward over the dessert plates and said, "You're good at this sort of thing," in the tone of a man complimenting a reliable piece of furniture. She had told herself this was simply how men of his generation spoke. She had told herself this so many times it had almost become true. Somewhere past midnight, Vivienne Ashford stopped telling herself that story. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no particular sense of chains falling or doors opening. It was quieter than that. More like a hand releasing something it had been gripping so long the grip had been forgotten. She got up. She did not pack in a panic. She moved through her dressing room with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, working by a single candle, selecting with care. Her own correspondence, letters from her sister Constance in Ohio, from 3 women whose property petition cases she had been advising through the courts, from the Philadelphia solicitor she had been corresponding with for 8 months, about a matter she had not yet needed and was now going to need. Her own financial records kept separately in a small locked portfolio that Gerald had never thought to ask about because the larger accounts had always arrived correct. A silver locket that had been her grandmother's. 2 dresses, her heaviest coat, despite the spring warmth, because she was thinking past the season. She paused over a small framed photograph, a formal portrait from the first year of the marriage, both of them standing the way you stand when a photograph is being taken. Arranged, still, performing permanence. She looked at the woman in it for a moment. Very young, very composed. Already, even then, holding her expression with the careful precision of someone who had been told that composure was the most important thing she owned. She set it on the dresser face up and moved on. The letter she left was 4 sentences long. She had thought about it many times, in the abstract, the way you think about emergency exits, noting their location, certain you'll never use them. I have managed this house and this marriage with everything I had. I am not leaving in anger. I am leaving because 9 years have taught me that my presence in your life and my absence from your attention are not incompatible, and I find I am no longer willing to prove that true. The accounts are in order. Everett knows where the Carlyle file is. She did not sign it, your wife. She signed it, Vivienne. The house was still when she came downstairs. The front lamp was burning. She had arranged, in the first year of the marriage, for a lamp to always be kept lit through the night, because she disliked dark entryways and because it was the kind of practical comfort that cost nothing and mattered to the people who lived there. She had never explained this preference to Gerald. He had simply found the lamp burning every night for 9 years and never wondered about it. She carried her bag to the back entry, the one that opened toward the kitchen garden and the lane that ran east toward the main road. It was 4 miles to the coaching inn at Carver's Crossing. She knew the road well. She had traveled it alone, more times than Gerald had ever known, on errands he had assumed were handled by the household staff and which she had preferred to handle herself, because doing things herself was the only way to be certain they were done correctly. She stood at the door for a moment. The house breathed around her in the particular way of a house you know so well you can feel its rhythms like a pulse. She had loved this place once. She was not certain, standing here in the dark, that she had stopped. But love for a house is not the same thing as consent to disappear inside it. She opened the door. The spring night came in cool and clean, smelling of turned earth and the distant sweetness of the apple trees along the western fence, which she had replanted 6 years ago because the old varieties weren't yielding. Gerald had never asked about the apple trees. He had simply noted one autumn that the preserves had improved. Vivienne Ashford stepped off the back step of the house she had managed for 9 years, pulled the door closed behind her without looking back, and walked down the lane in the dark. Gerald found the letter at 7:15 the following morning. He read it once, then read it again, then set it down and drank his coffee and told himself she had gone to her sister's. Constance lived in Dayton. Vivienne visited occasionally. She had simply He turned the letter over, found nothing on the back. She had simply gone to Constance, and the wording was unusual. But Vivienne had always been given to a certain precision of language that ran ahead of what was strictly necessary. He sent for Francis Webb 2 days later, when dinner had been served incorrectly 2 evenings in a row, and he had spent an afternoon in the study unable to locate the Pemberton file, which had always simply been there when he needed it, and which he now understood had been there because someone had been putting it there. The reply from Constance came on the 4th day. 4 words. "She is not here." Gerald stood in the front hallway holding the letter and felt something shift. Not fear precisely, but the particular unsteadiness of a man who has been certain he understood his house and has just discovered that the floor he was standing on was something someone else had built. He sent for Francis. Francis arrived the following afternoon and sat across from him in the study with the expression of a man who had been expecting to be sent for and had spent the intervening time deciding what to say. "She's gone," Gerald said. "I need to know where she is." Francis said nothing for a moment. "Then she left you a letter." "She left me a letter that doesn't explain anything." Gerald heard the slight distortion in his own voice, not grief, something adjacent, the discomfort of a man who has never been confused by something in his own house. "She said she was leaving because she wasn't seen. I see her every day." Francis looked at him. "Do you? Don't do that." "What did Commissioner Hale's wife say to you when she left on Tuesday?" "I don't." Gerald paused. "She thanked us for the evening." "What did Vivienne say to her, specifically?" Gerald looked at him. "I don't know." Francis nodded slowly as though this were information he had expected. He said, "Vivienne told her the brooch was Moravian silverwork," which it was, and asked whether it had belonged to her mother, which it had. "And Hale's wife told me afterward on the step that she hadn't expected to enjoy herself and that she hoped very much to come again." He paused. Vivienne knew that Hale needed his wife's approval before he'd commit to anything, and she handled it, and you didn't know she'd done it. He held Gerald's gaze steadily. "That's one conversation, at one dinner, on one evening. She was doing that every week for 9 years. Tell me the last time you asked her how she did it." Gerald said nothing. "You introduced her to Hale as your mother," Francis said, and his voice had gone lower. "You didn't stumble. You didn't catch yourself. You used your dead mother's name for your living wife with the ease of a man who has never had to think very hard about the difference, because both women occupied the same category in your mind. Functional. Present. Requiring nothing. That is not. Then tell me her grandmother's name." Silence. "Tell me which tenant family she rerouted the creek water for, and why. Tell me who she has been corresponding with in Philadelphia for the past 8 months. Tell me the name of the attorney who handled the Pemberton deed discrepancy that almost cost you the western parcel, and whether you were aware there was a discrepancy." Gerald was quiet. "You're a capable man," Francis said, and stood, "but you have been married to a woman of considerable intelligence for 9 years, and you have treated her the way you treat a good clock. You notice when she's running. You don't think about what keeps her wound." He picked up his coat. "I'll make inquiries. But Gerald, think carefully about what you intend when you find her. Because if you go to her with the expectation that she'll come home and resume her position, you are going to lose her permanently, and that will be entirely your own doing." He left. Gerald sat in the study for a long time after the door closed. The house revealed itself in the following days with a thoroughness that was almost pedagogical. On Monday, he discovered that the household's credit account with the dry goods supplier in Harrisburg had been negotiated personally by Vivienne at terms he had never known existed, and that the standard terms were 30% higher. On Wednesday, a letter arrived from the Philadelphia solicitor, addressed to Vivienne, which Gerald opened and did not understand for 3 full minutes, because the legal correspondence she had been managing concerned a property rights framework she had been quietly researching on behalf of 3 women in the county, and he had not known it existed. On Friday, he overheard the housekeeper Margaret tell the kitchen girl that Mrs. Ashford wasn't coming back from this one, not from this. "How do you know?" the kitchen girl asked. "Because I helped her press her good coat 3 weeks ago," Margaret said, "and she didn't tell me it was for a visit." Gerald walked past without acknowledging he had heard. He went to his study and stood at the window and thought, for the first time since the letter, about the specific expression on Vivienne's face at the dinner table. Not on the night of the commissioner's visit. Before that. A year before. 2 years. She had been looking at him with something he had read as serenity, and which he understood now. Standing at the window with nothing to manage and no one managing anything for him, had been something else entirely. The expression of a woman watching the distance between what she had and what she needed and measuring it with the precise attention she brought to everything. He had looked at that expression many times and moved on to the next thing, the next meeting, the next letter, the next request that had been handled by the time it crossed his desk. She had been disappearing for years. He had not seen it because disappearing in her case had looked like perfect management. Francis came back on the 16th day with information he did not immediately offer. He sat down and said, "First, what do you intend?" "I intend to bring her home." "No." Francis set his hat on the chair beside him. "You don't bring Vivienne anywhere. You ask. And the answer may be no." He looked at Gerald with the directness of a man who had used up his supply of diplomatic approaches. "She is in Pittsburgh. She found lodgings through one of the women she was corresponding with. The property petition cases." He paused. "She has 3 new clients, all of them women navigating estate disputes without legal representation. She has, apparently, been doing this work informally for 2 years, and the transition to doing it openly has been, according to my contact, seamless." He was quiet for a moment. "She refused to see me." Politely. The woman at the door said Mrs. Ashford was not receiving visitors from the estate, and delivered it with the composure of someone who had been given that instruction and intended to honor it. Gerald looked up. "She has someone managing her door. She has a life," Francis said. "That is what I have been trying to tell you for 2 weeks. Gerald, consider seriously what you intend to say to her. Because the man who shows up to that door expecting to retrieve something is going to find that there is nothing there to retrieve. She didn't leave a version of herself behind. She took everything when she went." Gerald sat with that for a long time after Francis left. He rode to Pittsburgh on a Thursday, without sending word ahead, because he told himself he did not want to give her the chance to refuse him before he had said what he needed to say. The real reason, the one he did not say aloud, was simpler and harder. He was afraid that if he wrote first, the refusal would come back in her handwriting, and he was not ready to hold that. He had spent 4 days since Francis's visit doing something he had never done with any real intention. He had sat still and thought about Vivienne. Not about how to handle the situation. About her. The way she moved through a room, not performing, not arranging herself for observation. Simply there, present, knowing exactly where she was and why. The way she had looked at Francis at dinner. A quick exchange of something that was not quite a signal, but was more than courtesy. The look of 2 people who spoke a common language that the rest of the table didn't know was being spoken. The way she had once, very early in the marriage, laughed at something he had said. A real laugh, brief and unguarded. And he had felt in that moment that he had been given access to something real, and had not, he understood now, thought to go back. He arrived at the address mid-morning. A narrow house on a well-kept street. Smaller than anything she had managed in 9 years, but chosen. He could see it in the way the window boxes were planted. Practical and not showy. In the way the step had been recently swept. This was not a place she had landed. It was a place she had selected. He knocked. A woman in her 50s opened the door with the calm eyes of someone carrying instructions. "I'm here to see Mrs. Ashford." "Your name, sir?" "Gerald Ashford." The woman looked at him steadily. "Mrs. Ashford is not receiving visitors from the estate. I am her husband." "Yes, sir, I'm aware." She did not move. A brief pause. "She asked me to give you this." She held out a folded note. He took it. "I am well. I am not ready to speak with you. I ask that you give me time." 3 sentences. No signature. He stood on that step holding 3 sentences while the door closed with a quiet finality that no amount of standing on the right side of it would have changed. He understood, with a force that no business negotiation had ever produced, that he had no leverage here. He was a man of property and standing in western Pennsylvania, and he was standing outside a rented house in Pittsburgh holding a note from a woman who had decided with complete composure that she was not yet willing to see him, and there was nothing, not argument, not reason, not the 15 years of provision he had been about to cite, that was going to change that on her timeline. He did not leave the city. He sent a letter the following morning. He had written and discarded 5 versions before arriving at one that was short enough to be honest. Every longer version had become a man making his case, and he had finally understood, somewhere in the 4th draft, that she was not a committee to be convinced. She was a person he had not seen, and he did not yet know how to be the kind of man who saw her. But he understood that starting from argument was the wrong direction entirely. I am not here to ask you to come home. I am here because I owe you something I do not yet know how to give. I would be grateful for the chance to try, at a time and in a place of your choosing. He waited 2 days. The reply came on a Saturday in her precise, familiar hand. There is a public lecture at the Allegheny Institute on Tuesday evening. A panel on property inheritance law and the rights of widows. I will be attending. I will not be attending with you. I will not prevent you from attending a public event. He read it twice. It was not an invitation. It was Vivienne drawing a line and leaving a space on the other side of it, which, he was learning, was how she had always communicated, not by opening doors all the way, but by leaving them unlocked. He wrote back one word. Tuesday. He arrived early and sat near the back, which was not where Gerald Ashford normally sat anywhere. He sat at the back because he was not there as Gerald Ashford of the estate. He was there as a man who had been given a very small amount of rope and understood that how he held it was being observed. The hall filled. Vivienne arrived 10 minutes after the panel began, which he understood was deliberate, a signal that she was not managing his experience of the evening. She was accompanied by a woman he didn't know, perhaps 50, who deferred to Vivienne in small ways that indicated Vivienne was her guide rather than her guest. They took seats in the 3rd row. Vivienne removed her gloves, opened a small notebook, and did not look toward the back of the room. Gerald watched her for an hour. He had been married to her for 9 years. He was watching her now the way you look at something you have walked past so many times. The looking has become automatic and you have stopped seeing. She raised her hand during the panel discussion and asked a question, clear, specific, better formed than anything the panelists had asked each other, citing a case by name and statute. The panelist answered with the slightly startled respect of a man encountering a sharper mind than he'd expected in the 3rd row. The woman beside her touched her arm briefly. Vivienne smiled. Small, private. The smile of a woman who did not need the approval but was glad for the warmth. It was not the smile she had worn at the commissioner's dinner. That smile had been a door closing. This one simply was. It belonged to her. Afterward, when the hall had thinned, she turned. She had known he was there. She had located him when she came in, processed it, returned to the panel. He understood this now, in the way you understand things about a person, when you have finally stopped moving long enough to actually look. She did not come to him. She stood near her seat and waited while people filed past, and when the space had cleared enough, he walked to her. They stood a few feet apart. "Vivienne," he said. "Gerald." Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm. The careful neutrality of a woman who had decided to take this one exchange at a time. The panel was strong, he said, because it was, and because he did not know how to start anywhere useful except with what was true. Your question was better than theirs. She held his gaze. Dr. Whitmore's position on intestate inheritance is 50 years behind the statute. She said it simply, not performance. Possession. "I know I called you the wrong name," he said. And then because every version of what he had prepared had started in the wrong place, he stopped. He started again. Every version of this I have practiced starts with me explaining myself. And I understand, he paused, that an explanation is the one thing that will not help either of us right now. Vivienne was very still. I would like to call on you, he said, not to argue, not to persuade, to say things I should have said 9 years ago, if I had known enough then to know I needed to. He held her gaze. I have a list of things that are not arguments. I would like to say them to your face. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady and precise. I do not think your regret and my safety are the same thing. The sentence went into him like a key turning a lock he hadn't known was locked. He didn't answer immediately because there was no immediate answer worth giving. He stood with it. He let her watch him stand with it, and the fact that he didn't immediately redirect or qualify or reframe toward something more manageable. She registered this. Not as forgiveness, as information. No, he said finally. They aren't. You're right. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I walk in Allegheny Park on Wednesday mornings. I am there from 9 until 10:30. I am not inviting you to join me. I am telling you where I am. She collected her notebook and her gloves. Good evening, Gerald. She walked to the woman waiting near the door, said something brief and warm, and they left together. Gerald stood in the emptied hall for a long time. I do not think your regret and my safety are the same thing. He turned it over. Not as a wound he had been given, but as a truth he had been shown. The kind of truth that, once you have heard it clearly, you cannot argue yourself back out of. He was in the park at 8:45 on Wednesday. He told himself this was not eagerness. He had a lifelong tendency toward lateness that Vivienne had navigated around for years, adjusting their departure times, their dinner reservations, the start of every social engagement. And for once in his life he intended to be where he had said he would be before the time he had been told. She arrived precisely at 9. She saw him and did not alter her pace. She said to the woman beside her, a few minutes, Cecilia, and Cecilia assessed him with the frank economy of a woman who had been briefed and was conducting her own verification. Whatever her conclusion, she moved to a different path. Vivienne sat at the other end of the bench. Measured distance. You came, she said. You told me where you'd be. I also told you it wasn't an invitation. I know. He looked at her directly. I thought you'd probably counted on it anyway. Something shifted in her face. Brief and involuntary, almost amusement. Yes, she said. I had. He drew a breath. I want to tell you what I've understood. Not to argue. He paused and started from a different place. Francis told me you were advising property cases here. He said you were good at it, and the way he said it. He stopped. I realized I had no right to be surprised. I had watched you do the same work for this household for 9 years, and I had never called it work. I called it things running smoothly. The same way I would say the roof doesn't leak. No credit attached, no intelligence attached. Just presence and function, and the assumption that both would continue. Vivienne said nothing. I called you by my mother's name, he said, in front of everyone. And I didn't know I had done it. That is the thing I cannot get past. Not that I said it, that it came out of me so easily, as though your name and her name occupied the same category. And when I reached for one, I might equally have found the other, and it wouldn't have mattered because the category was what I actually meant. Not you. Not either of you. The category. His voice had gone lower. He was not performing this. She would have known if he were. She had been reading him for 9 years with more accuracy than he had ever known. I have been trying to understand, he said, how I became a man who did that. And I keep arriving at the same answer. I never had to look. You made everything work so completely that looking seemed unnecessary. And I mistook things working for everything being fine. It wasn't fine, she said. It hasn't been fine for years. I know that now. You didn't want to know it then. No. He held her gaze. Knowing it would have required something from me. It was easier not to give it. The honesty of that landed between them, clean and undecorated. And Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want, Gerald?" The question was not rhetorical. It was the actual question. He held her gaze. "I want to know you the way I should have known you 9 years ago. The way a person deserves to be known by the person they share their life with." She looked at him for a long time. "I'm not coming back to what we were," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was absolute. "The Ashford house. That arrangement. I will not return to being the mechanism by which your life runs while your life moves through me without seeing me. Not for security, not for reputation, not for anything." "I know," he said. "I have a life here. Work that matters. Women who need what I know how to do. Cecilia, who argues with me about inheritance law over dinner and is," she paused briefly, "a better use of my evenings than I had access to before." She met his eyes. "I am a person, Gerald. Not a well-run household. A person." "You always were," he said. "I simply didn't see it." "No," she said, "you didn't. The question I have been asking myself for 5 weeks is whether you are capable of seeing it now. Genuinely. Not because the house isn't running and your accounts are confused and your social standing is fraying at the edges. But genuinely." He didn't answer immediately. She waited. She had always been willing to wait. He was beginning to understand how much that willingness had cost her. "I don't know," he said. "I think I might be. I believe I am different than I was 2 months ago. But I understand that my belief about myself is not proof. And you are not someone I want to ask to take my word for things. Not after 9 years of asking you to take things on faith and giving you nothing in return but the faith that it was enough." Vivienne looked at him. She was reading him with the full attention she had always been capable of and had rarely, he now understood, been able to give him freely, because attention toward him had always required her to simultaneously manage what his attention was not covering. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Same hour." He blinked. "Wednesdays. I'm changing it to twice a week," she said. "If you're going to be in my life, I want to see whether it holds. Not once a week. Twice." He understood this was not generosity. It was information gathering. She was building a data set. "Don't be late," she said, and stood, and called to Cecilia, who came forward with the expression of a woman who had formed precise opinions and planned to share them over supper. Gerald sat on the bench for a long time after they had gone. He had come here expecting to find a woman who needed to be reassured. What he had found was a woman who had taken 9 years of quietly accumulated capability and built from it, in 5 weeks, a life that fit her rather than requiring her to fit it. He had arrived with the intention to retrieve. He was beginning to understand that the actual work was not retrieval. It was the slow, uncertain labor of becoming someone who deserved to be let in. He came back Thursday, and Wednesday after that, and Thursday again, and the weeks began to accumulate their own architecture. Vivienne set the terms. He was not to speak about returning to the estate. He was not to bring gifts. He was not to begin any sentence with "when you come home," because there was no version of that sentence she was prepared to receive. What he could do was listen, and he discovered in those first weeks that he was worse at it than he had believed and better at it than he had been. She talked about the widow cases with the specific detail of someone who expected to be understood, not managed, and he asked follow-up questions that were real questions, and she noticed that they were real and stored the noticing privately. Cecilia had opinions. She shared them with Vivienne over supper one evening with the directness of a woman who considered honesty a form of care. "He's trying," Cecilia said. "He is," Vivienne agreed. "Is trying enough?" Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is exactly what I'm sitting with. The man in that park is not the man who called me by his mother's name in front of the county commissioner." She set down her cup. "But the man in that park could have been there 8 years ago, or 5, or last winter. And I spent those years beside the other one, waiting." She paused. "I don't entirely know what to do with the grief of that." Cecilia said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The letter that changed the weight of things arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. It was from Francis Webb, and it contained one paragraph. He wrote that Gerald had, 3 weeks prior, made a private contribution to the Pittsburgh Women's Property Rights Assistance Fund, a substantial sum, directed specifically toward cases involving contested estate inheritance, given without public notice and without his name attached to any formal record. The fund administrator had assumed Vivienne already knew. She did not. Francis, who had found out through the administrator, was not certain whether to tell her, and had decided to, on the grounds that she deserved to know. 3 weeks ago, before the second Wednesday, before Gerald had said anything about his father, or about the pattern he had absorbed from watching his father's marriage, or about any of the things he had been saying in the park, he had done it without telling her. Without waiting to use it, she stood in the front room with the letter and did not take off her coat. Cecilia found her there 40 minutes later. He gave money to the property fund, Vivienne said. 3 weeks ago. Anonymously. Cecilia sat down across from her. He didn't tell you. He didn't tell you. He didn't tell me. A silence. Well, Cecilia said. That's a different kind of thing. Yes, Vivienne said. It is. She did not bring it up the following Wednesday. She had planned to, but when she sat down and looked at him, he was thinner than he'd been in August, and he had the look of a man who had stopped trying to conceal something. He asked about the Haverford case before she could say anything, because she had mentioned it the previous week, and he had remembered, and the question was a real one. She answered him. They talked for the full hour, and she felt, during that hour, something she had been feeling for several weeks. Not gradually rebuilt trust, exactly, but the progressive absence of bracing. She had been waiting, every week, for him to slip back into the man who had not seen her. And he was not slipping. And the not slipping was, slowly, becoming its own kind of information. She did not tell him any of this. She kept it close. Francis came to her door on a Friday in late October with the expression of a man carrying news he was uncertain how to deliver. She let him in and poured coffee and waited. He signed documents, Francis said. She set her cup down carefully. What documents? A property settlement in your name. He consulted 2 solicitors. It's formal and binding. If you never return, you have legal financial security that cannot be contested. If you do return, it remains yours, entirely independent regardless. He paused. He asked me to tell you because he said if he told you himself it would feel like evidence, like he was presenting it to advance an argument. He said, and these are his exact words, he wanted it to be something he should have done years ago, before you had any reason to need it. Not leverage, just something a man does when he finally understands what it means to respect someone. Vivienne was very still. When? She said. The same week as the fund contribution. He'd begun the process before. She stood and walked to the window. Both of those things, she said slowly. Before any of this, before the Thursdays, before the letters. He wasn't holding them. No, Francis said. He wasn't. She stayed at the window for a long time. When she turned back, her face was composed, but her eyes held something that composure alone could not contain. Is he different? She said. Actually, not because he's uncomfortable without me, not because the house isn't running, genuinely. Francis considered this for a long moment. I think, he said carefully, that he has understood something that cannot be ununderstood. Whether that holds permanently, I cannot promise you. What I can tell you is that the man who sent for me in September and told me you were making a point and would be back by Tuesday is not the man who sat in that same chair last week and asked me what he should do and meant it as a question, not as a preamble to telling me what he'd already decided. Vivienne nodded. She looked at Francis. You always tell me the truth. You always ask for it, he said. Most people don't. She sent Gerald a note that evening. Come to supper Sunday, 7 o'clock. Cecilia will be here. Come as yourself. He arrived at 10 to 7. Cecilia opened the door, assessed him with the frank economy she brought to all assessments, and said, You're early. I'm trying to be reliable, he said. Cecilia's expression shifted into something that was not quite approval but was adjacent to it. She stepped back and let him in. The table was small and set 4-3. No formal arrangement, no strategic seating, no managed impression. Just a table, and food, and 3 people in a room together. Gerald sat where Vivienne indicated, and did not look around the room with the evaluating eye of a man comparing it to something else. He looked at what was in front of him. The supper was good. The conversation moved carefully at first. The Haverford case, the fund committee, a Judge Francis had mentioned. And then, slowly, it moved somewhere more ordinary. Gerald told a story about one of the tenant farmers and a horse that had developed opinions about Tuesday mornings. And Vivienne added a detail to the story he hadn't known. She had known everything that happened on that property. Every small comedy of it, and he had never thought to ask her to tell it. And the table laughed, and the laughter was real. Afterward, Cecilia excused herself with the precise timing of a woman who understood exactly when to leave a room. Vivienne and Gerald sat across the small table with coffee between them. I know about the documents, she said, and the fund. He went still. Francis told me. He nodded. He had not been waiting to be caught. He had been waiting to see whether she would find out, and what it would mean when she did. You did them before any of this, she said. You weren't waiting to use them as evidence. I didn't want them to be evidence. She looked at him across the small table. I spent 9 years, she said, making sure the right people saw your work, making sure you were in the right room, that the right conversation happened at the right moment. She paused. And you found a way to make sure my work was seen, without asking me, without making it about you. I was returning something long owed, he said. That's all. It isn't all, she said. You know it isn't. He was quiet. I want you to understand something. She folded her hands on the table. I am not returning to the estate. I will keep this house and this work and Cecilia and my name in these circles. She looked at him steadily. But I think we might try to build something. Not a restoration. Something new. With different terms. What kind of terms? What kind of terms, he said. Honest ones. She held his gaze. If I look across any table we share and see the expression of a man who is not seeing the person across from him, I will say so directly, and I will expect you to hear it. If I am doing work that is worth seeing, I expect you to see it. Not to manage how others perceive it, to actually see it. In the room, in front of people. Yes, he said. And if you come to me, she paused, you come to me, to my house, on my ground, as someone who understands that my life here is not a temporary arrangement. It is my life. I understand that. She studied his face. Then she said, There's a panel on property law next Thursday evening. Cecilia and I are presenting 2 cases to the Women's Legal Association. She held his gaze. I would like you to be in the room. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that and more genuine. I'll be there, he said. Don't introduce yourself as my husband, she said. Come as someone who is there because the work matters. He looked at her across the small table, in the lamplight of the house she had chosen. At the supper she had set on her own terms. I understand, he said. I will. The Legal Association panel drew a substantial audience for a Thursday evening. Cecilia presented first, clearly and with the precision of a woman who had spent years being underestimated and had made the education of the unprepared into a kind of art. Then Vivienne stood. She presented 2 cases. The Haverford estate dispute and a second matter involving a contested farm inheritance, with the specificity and legal clarity of someone who had been doing this work, informally and without recognition, for the better part of a decade, and who was now doing it in a room full of people with the authority to formalize it. The room had the quality it sometimes gets when the person at the front of it is measurably better than the occasion had promised. Afterward, in the conversation that followed, a man near the back, one of the association's committee members, leaned to the person beside him and asked, not quietly enough, who is she exactly? Before his companion could answer, Gerald Ashford, who was standing 2 rows behind them, and had been standing there for an hour with the full, unmanaged attention of a man watching someone he had spent 9 years failing to look at, said clearly, and without being asked, "Mrs. Vivienne Ashford. She has been managing property cases in this county for 2 years and in western Pennsylvania for considerably longer than that. If your committee has not spoken to her formally, that is the committee's loss." The man turned, recognized Gerald, and recalibrated his expression. Vivienne, standing 4 rows forward, heard it. She did not turn around immediately. She let it settle. Let it move through her the way something genuinely new moves through a person who has waited for it without quite believing it was coming. Then she turned her head just enough. Gerald was watching her. Not with the absent expression of a man maintaining appearances, not with the managed attention of someone aware of being observed. With full, present, unguarded attention, the look of a man who saw the woman in front of him and knew, with the clarity of someone who had almost missed the thing entirely, exactly who she was. Vivienne Ashford held his gaze across those 4 rows, and she smiled. Not the smile she had given Commissioner Hale's dinner table. The composed, expensive smile of a woman deciding in silence to leave. Not the careful, performed smile of 9 years of making everything work for a man who had not noticed the effort. This one was different. It was the smile of a woman who had walked out of a house before dawn with one bag in her own name, who had built something real in a Pittsburgh row house with a colleague who argued with her about statutes and 3 clients who needed exactly what she had spent 9 years learning without permission to call it learning, who had sat across a small supper table and offered terms on her own authority, and watched a man she had once given everything to choose, with full knowledge of what it cost him, to meet her on her ground. It was the smile of a woman who had not left to punish anyone, who had left because staying had become a slow, daily betrayal of herself, who had discovered, on the other side of that leaving, that she did not need to be retrieved or forgiven or restored to where she had been. She needed to be seen. And she was. She turned back to the room, raised her notes, and answered the next question. She had work to do.